The Apache Wars reshaped the American Southwest, turning mesas, canyons, and arid plains into arenas of strategy, endurance, and negotiation. Across the 19th century, Apache leaders such as Cochise and Geronimo, and countless unnamed scouts and families, used intimate knowledge of the land to resist displacement and to negotiate survival. This is a story of tactics and terrain, of treaties and broken promises, and of cultural resilience that outlasted the immediate conflict. You will see how landscape became a weapon, how small, mobile bands challenged larger forces, and why these encounters matter to the region's identity today. Expect first-hand accounts, maps that reveal hidden movements, and a clearer picture of choices made under pressure, not sensationalized, but rooted in human experience. If you appreciate careful, balanced history, please consider subscribing for more thoughtful explorations. We begin at dawn on a red mesa, a pale sky, a thin column of smoke, and the hush before decisions are made. Introduction. When Anglo-American and Mexican expansion pushed deeper into the desert basins and mountain strongholds of the Southwest, determined resistance followed. Apache bands, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Western, and others, met incursions with a combination of raiding, retreating to rugged canyons, and sustained campaigning that challenged both settlers and standing armies. Battles were not isolated skirmishes. They formed part of a prolonged contest over land, resources, and sovereignty that shaped the region's social and political landscape. Tensions were driven by multiple, concrete causes: competition for grazing and water, the disruption of traditional lifeways by settlers and miners, and a string of misunderstandings and broken agreements that inflamed local grievances. The Bascom Affair, a diplomatic rupture involving an army officer and Cochise's band, is one well-documented flashpoint that broadened localized disputes into a wider conflict. Forced relocations to reservations, exemplified by the difficult experience at San Carlos, further intensified resistance as leaders and families sought to preserve mobility and autonomy. Warfare in this setting emphasized mobility, intimate terrain knowledge, and adaptive tactics. Apache fighters used horses, concealment in canyons, and rapid, small unit operations to strike and withdraw before larger forces could respond. The U.S. Army and Mexican forces relied on a network of forts, long patrols, and sometimes recruited Apache scouts to counter these methods. Fort Bowie stands as a clear example of a military garrison established to control a strategic pass rather than to hold vast territory, and its presence illustrates how infrastructure and supply lines influenced operations on both sides. Prominent leaders emerged who embodied both resistance and negotiation. Names like Cochise, Mangas Coloradus, Victorio, and Geronimo recur in contemporary accounts and later histories. The final, formal end of the long campaign is often associated with Geronimo's surrender in 1886 and his subsequent imprisonment at Fort Sill, which symbolized a shift from armed resistance to enforced containment. The legacy of these struggles persists in place names, historic sites, and museums, and in the living communities that trace lineage to the bands involved. Memories of resistance inform modern conversations about land, identity, and rights in the Southwest, and they continue to be reassessed by scholars and local communities alike. If this brief overview was useful, consider subscribing for more calm, carefully sourced narratives about the American West and its peoples. Life in the Southwest. During the 19th century, life in the American Southwest unfolded across a landscape of sharp contrasts: arid plateaus and fertile river valleys, high mountain forests and sun-scorched basins. Winters could be cold at elevation and summers relentlessly hot on the desert floor, so communities oriented themselves around reliable water sources and seasonal resources. The Rio Grande and tributary river corridors, along with springs and cienagas, became lifelines where irrigated fields, orchards, and riparian woodlands supported denser settlement and regular trade. Many indigenous bands in the region maintained mobile, flexible lifeways adapted to that variability. Small family groups moved with the seasons, setting up brush shelters called wickiups or using natural rock alcoves when available. They foraged widely for piñon nuts, mesquite beans, prickly pear pads, and agave hearts, and supplemented those staples with hunting of deer and small game. Horses transformed daily life, extending range, enabling more efficient hunting and travel, and reshaping social relationships and trade patterns. Skilled basketry, beadwork, and rawhide and leatherworking furnished both practical objects and items for exchange, while personal knowledge of plants and water sources governed survival. Hispanic and mixed communities developed a different set of adaptations that nevertheless responded to the same landscape. Adobe homes clustered around plazas, and acequia irrigation systems supported fields of maize, chili, beans, and small orchards. Sheep and goats grazed the open country, producing wool that fed a local textile economy. Weaving in family workshops turned raw fleece into rugs and blankets sold at regional markets. Life in these settlements blended domestic routine with communal labor. Cooperative maintenance of irrigation ditches, shared harvests, and local trading fairs where blacksmithing, carpentry, and small-scale commerce sustained daily needs. Anglo settlers, traders, and military outposts added new economic channels and technologies to the mix, creating hubs where goods and information converged. Trading posts and stage routes linked remote camps with larger towns, bringing metal tools, cloth, and trade goods into circulation and carrying wool, hides, and agricultural produce outward. Travel remained challenging, so local ingenuity persisted. Water-saving gardening techniques, seasonal migration to higher pastures, and intricate knowledge of weather patterns continued to shape choices. Everyday life in the Southwest was practical and adaptive, a fabric woven from diverse peoples and livelihoods. And if you found this calm, factual account useful, please consider subscribing for more. Escalating conflict. When settlers, miners, and railroad crews pushed deeper into the Southwest, competition over water, grazing land, and trade routes turned intermittent raids into sustained campaigns. Apache bands, already defending ancestral hunting grounds and seasonal ranges, intensified raids on livestock and supply trains as a means of survival and resistance. A single diplomatic breakdown could spark a long chain of reprisals. The Bascom Affair is a clear example, when accusations, the seizure of hostages, and escape attempts transformed a local dispute into years of bitter retaliation between Cochise's band and American forces. Military responses escalated in scope and method as regular units, volunteer regiments, and frontier militias converged on contested valleys and mountain passes. Fortifications were erected and existing posts reinforced to guard wagon routes and water sources. One stark example is the engagement at Apache Pass, where soldiers employed mountain artillery against concealed warriors who used the rugged terrain to their advantage. Short-term patrols gave way to sustained patrols, and the army increasingly relied on mobility, supply convoys, and blockhouses to try to deny raiders easy access to targets. Apache tactics adapted in turn, emphasizing small, agile war parties, intimate knowledge of canyons and seasonal trails, and surprise strikes that inflicted material losses without exposing large groups to decisive battle. Leaders such as Cochise, Mangas Coloradus, Victorio, and later Geronimo used that mobility to evade larger forces and to sow uncertainty among settlers and troops. At the same time, United States commanders altered their approach. Some pursued scorched earth measures and punitive expeditions, while others, like General George Crook, combined relentless pursuit with the recruitment of Apache scouts to track bands and negotiate conditional surrenders. The Army also made pragmatic use of African American cavalry regiments, often called Buffalo Soldiers, who performed long-range patrols across difficult terrain. The conflict spilled across the international border, complicating any single government's ability to enforce peace. Apache groups routinely moved between the highlands of what is now the American Southwest and the mountain and desert regions of northern Mexico, taking advantage of jurisdictional gaps. Mexican military forces and local militias responded with their own campaigns, and cross-border pursuits became a routine, yet diplomatically fraught, feature of the struggle. That fluidity helped prolong resistance by allowing fighters to withdraw beyond the reach of pursuing columns and then re-emerge to strike again. Ultimately, escalation produced consequences that reshaped communities on both sides of the conflict. The mounting cost in lives, livestock, and commerce persuaded U.S. authorities to prioritize removal, confinement, and assimilation policies intended to end raiding by severing the logistical bases of resistance. Many Apache were forced onto reservations or transported far from their homelands, and family groups were broken up in the process. The cycle of broken promises, contested authority, and mutual reprisals left a legacy of mistrust and trauma, but it also demonstrated the resilience and tactical sophistication of Apache resistance. If you found this overview helpful, please consider subscribing for more calm, close readings of complex historical episodes. Guerrilla warfare. When U.S. and Mexican forces pressed into Apache homelands, Apache fighters turned mountains, deserts, and canyons into a strategic advantage that armies trained for open-field engagements struggled to overcome. Small, flexible bands moved faster than supply trains and knew every hidden spring and ledge. Leaders who emerged from those bands, figures such as Cochise, Geronimo, Victorio, and Nana, combined intimate local knowledge with ruthless discipline in order to control space rather than hold fixed positions. Raids and ambushes formed the backbone of their approach, executed with suddenness and precision. Columns on narrow mountain roads were favored targets. A single well-placed ambush could scatter soldiers and force a long, costly pursuit. Night movements and quick strikes on isolated ranches or patrols kept larger forces off balance. Logistics mattered as much as tactics. Capturing horses and cattle replenished supplies, caches concealed in rocky outcrops sustained long withdrawals, and careful timing around water sources determined the direction of travel. At times, feigned retreats and deceptive trails drew pursuing troops into terrain chosen by Apache fighters. The result was a war of attrition that relied on mobility and surprise rather than massed infantry. Social organization and local intelligence underpinned these battlefield methods. Warrior bands operated with considerable autonomy, able to split, reunite, or disperse as conditions required, while family groups moved with them to provide food, repair arms, and tend the wounded. Networks of scouts and lookouts passed information rapidly across mountain ridges, and messengers could traverse difficult country where regular patrols dared not follow. The U.S. Army adapted in turn, recruiting Apache scouts, establishing a string of forts, and coordinating cross-border operations, but even those changes could not instantly neutralize the advantages conferred by terrain and local support. Cross-border movement into Mexico complicated pursuit and frustrated conventional attempts to pin down small, determined units. The enduring lesson lies in the combination of cultural adaptation and practical improvisation. A people accustomed to mobility and intimate knowledge of the land converted those strengths into a resilient form of irregular warfare. Tactically, their methods anticipated many principles of modern small unit operations: decentralization, rapid movement, exploitation of intelligence, and use of the environment as a force multiplier. Strategically, those same methods prolonged conflict and forced adversaries to innovate their own countermeasures. For a deeper look at how these patterns shaped later military thinking, consider subscribing for more thoughtful history content. Key battles and campaigns. Apache resistance in the Southwest was punctuated by a series of confrontations and extended campaigns that tested both Apache mobility and the logistical limits of the United States Army. A single diplomatic incident in the Chiricahua country ignited one of the most consequential cycles of reprisal and counter-reprisal, eroding fragile trust and setting off raids, rescues, and punitive expeditions that echoed for years. Leaders on both sides adapted quickly. Apache war parties exploited mountain passes and water sources, while Army commanders built forts, gathered scouts, and pushed columns into difficult country. A turning point came in one particularly fierce clash in a narrow desert pass where Apache fighters, using rock outcrops and intimate knowledge of the terrain, slowed a larger military force and bought time for their families to move. The Army responded by bringing field artillery into the region and by fortifying the approaches with a permanent post that would control the main route. That encounter underscored a theme repeated across the Southwest. When the Army could bring superior firepower and a fixed base to bear, Apache bands were forced into new patterns of movement and concealment. Even so, Apache tactics, hit-and-run raids, ambushes on supply lines, and quick dispersal into rugged canyons kept regular troops off balance. Campaigns led by figures such as General George Crook illustrate how adaptation worked both ways. Crook sought to combine relentless patrolling with diplomacy, enlisting Apache scouts to track raiding parties and employing winter campaigning in mountainous terrain where many bands sheltered. Those scouts proved decisive in locating camps and intercepting movements that conventional cavalry patrols could not. At the same time, Crook's efforts showed the limits of force alone. He negotiated truces with some leaders, promising rations and land in return for surrender, and those agreements sometimes held, briefly, before new pressures and misunderstandings reignited fighting. Parallel to Crook's operations were the campaigns mounted against charismatic Apache leaders who kept the struggle alive across borders. Victorio led a protracted series of raids that crossed what are now international lines, using swift mule-borne strikes and deep knowledge of borderland refuges to evade pursuit. Mexican and U.S. forces eventually coordinated more closely in response, and a concentrated Mexican offensive in desert lowlands brought an end to Victorio's campaign, with many of his band killed or captured. The fall of that band demonstrated how joint operations and persistent pressure could break even the most seasoned raiders. Geronimo's years of resistance represent another pattern: repeated surrenders and escapes, each followed by renewed pursuit. He and his followers slipped in and out of remote highlands and sought sanctuary in rugged mountain ranges and the Sierra Madre. American commanders shifted strategies in response, increasing the use of mounted units, tightening patrols, and expanding cross-border operations in cooperation with Mexican forces. The culmination of that phase of resistance was the confinement of many Apache leaders and their families to distant posts, where exile and the loss of homeland ultimately ended large-scale organized opposition. The campaigns that led their combined direct combat, protracted tracking expeditions, political negotiation, and logistical pressure. Taken together, these battles and campaigns expose a conflict shaped as much by terrain and mobility as by numbers. Small unit tactics and intimate local knowledge often gave Apache bands the initiative, while permanence and firepower eventually allowed external forces to control key corridors and water sources. The legacy of those engagements is complex. Individual battles could be decisive in the short term, but long-term outcomes depended on supply chains, political will, and cross-border cooperation. If you appreciate clear, source-based narratives like this, consider subscribing for more calm historical accounts. Final surrenders. During the 19th century, Apache bands faced relentless pressure that gradually pushed them toward formal capitulation, and the final surrenders were often less the product of a single decisive battle than the outcome of sustained military campaigns, negotiated truces, and the exhaustion of resources. Commanders used a mix of diplomacy and force, placing scouts in the field, intercepting food supplies, and offering terms that ranged from reservation life to imprisonment. In many cases, leaders accepted terms to protect families and preserve what remained of their communities. Cochise's negotiated peace in the Chiricahua stronghold stands as an example of compromise, a leader who sought a settled arrangement for his people rather than continued bloodshed, and whose decision reshaped Apache relations with the United States in that region. Other bands, however, resisted until relief became impossible, and their eventual surrenders reflected both strategic defeat and profound weariness. After formal surrender agreements were reached, the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Promises of supplies and secure land were a common bargaining point, yet implementation was uneven and often marred by delay or neglect. Many Apaches were relocated hundreds of miles away from ancestral homelands, a displacement that severed seasonal foodways, healing practices, and family networks. Men, women, and children found themselves under tight military supervision as prisoners of war or as dependents on government rations. The isolation of these transfers compounded the trauma of loss and signaled a dramatic shift from sovereign resistance to managed containment. Personal stories illuminate the human side of these transitions. Some leaders who had once wielded considerable autonomy spent their final years under army watch, adapting to regimented life in distant posts while trying to maintain cultural ties. Children raised in confinement learned English and new customs, and yet elders preserved songs and stories in secret. Long-term exile created mixed legacies. A handful were eventually permitted to return to homelands or to live on nearby reservations, while many families remained bound to military forts for decades, their identities reshaped by enforced residency and federal oversight. The final surrenders also had broader political and cultural repercussions that lasted well beyond the immediate military chapter. Federal Indian policy moved toward assimilationist programs, boarding schools, and allotment schemes that aimed to erode communal landholding and traditional governance. Public perceptions of the Apache shifted as well. Sensational accounts and newspaper dispatches turned complex resistance into simplified narratives of outlawry for some audiences, even as veterans and observers debated the ethics of confinement and exile. Reflecting on these endings reveals not only the cessation of organized armed resistance, but also how surrender inaugurated a new era of negotiation over memory, rights, and restitution. If you want more narratives that trace individual lives through these final moments and their aftermath, consider subscribing for further episodes that explore the people, places, and policies behind these pivotal surrenders. Legacy. The aftermath of the conflicts in the Southwest left enduring patterns of displacement, legal change, and cultural survival that still shape lives and landscapes. Apache groups such as the Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, San Carlos, Western, Lipan, and Plains Apache were dispersed in various ways, some escorted to military forts, others confined to newly created reservations, producing long-term shifts in land tenure and local economies. Federal policies, military removal, and subsequent resettlement fractured traditional patterns of seasonal movement and access to sacred places, and those disruptions became a central part of the modern Apache experience. Geronimo and other leaders who were moved to exile locations remain names tied to that painful transition in public memory. Cultural resilience responded to those pressures with adaptation and renewal. Strong traditions in basketry, beadwork, storytelling, and ceremony were preserved and are actively taught within families and tribal schools, while language revitalization programs and immersion classes work to restore Southern Athabascan languages to new generations. Tribal enterprises now often balance cultural preservation with economic necessity. Cultural centers, museums, and tourism initiatives interpret Apache history for visitors, while enterprises such as hospitality, renewable energy projects, and natural resource management provide revenue and employment for tribal communities. Education efforts, both inside and outside reservations, increasingly incorporate oral histories and tribal perspectives into curricula, changing how the wider public understands the past. Legal and political legacies are visible in contemporary governance and law. The struggle over sovereignty, treaty interpretation, and land rights produced a framework in which tribal governments exercise self-determination, manage natural resources, and pursue legal remedies to protect sacred sites. Repatriation efforts led by tribes, often under federal statutes that require return of ancestral remains and sacred objects from museums, have reopened dialogues about stewardship and memory. Activism over sacred places remains particularly vivid. The San Carlos Apaches' opposition to proposed mining at a place known as Oak Flat is an example of how historical dispossession has transformed into modern legal and public campaigns to protect culturally significant landscapes. Meanwhile, the enlistment of Apache scouts by the U.S. Army during and after conflicts is a lesser-known thread that influenced frontier military practices and complicated relations between nations. Memory and representation continue to evolve, reshaping monuments, museums, and public narratives. Several preserved sites, Fort Bowie and federally protected natural areas such as Chiricahua National Monument, serve as places where archaeological evidence, military history, and indigenous accounts intersect, creating opportunities for collaborative interpretation. Contemporary scholarship and indigenous-led exhibits have begun to correct decades of one-sided storytelling in popular culture, offering more balanced, nuanced portraits that center Apache agency and voice. Artistic and literary projects by Apache creators, along with collaborative museum repatriations and educational programs, contribute to healing and to a broader public understanding of what was lost and what has been carried forward. If this overview was helpful, please consider subscribing for more calm, well-sourced explorations of the region's living histories. What endures from the Apache Wars is not just the record of conflict but the resilience of communities who fought to protect home, culture, and autonomy. Over the course of the 19th century, expanding settlements and broken treaties collided with Apache resistance led by determined leaders, resulting in campaigns, forced removals, negotiations, and, ultimately, profound loss, and yet cultural survival. We traced how strategies of mobility and knowledge of the land enabled resistance, how promises were too often betrayed, and how the legacy of these encounters still shapes the Southwest today. If this story resonated with you, you are part of keeping these histories alive. Share your thoughts or family connections in the comments. Your perspective matters. If you'd like to follow more careful explorations of Indigenous histories and the landscapes that shape them, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. In upcoming episodes, we will examine related chapters, including the Long Walk and the continuing stories of contemporary Apache communities. Thank you for watching and for listening to these important voices.